So next, we're going to listen to Elizabeth Killinger. First, we learned about your environment and your landscape and everything that's involved in your landscape and the environment. Now she's going to take it the next step forward and kind of look at all of the weather that's going to be in your landscape and make sure that your landscape is ready for that weather. So Elizabeth, it's all up to you now.
All right, thank you, Terry. My name's Elizabeth Killinger. I'm an extension educator out of the Hall County Extension Office in Grand Island. A few years ago, within Extension, we started taking a look at, what can we do to help homeowners and others get ready for the weather extremes that we have in Nebraska. So working together with our water group, working together with our climate group and disaster preparedness, we came out with these weather-ready landscapes infographics that we're going to talk about. So to start off, we need to know the difference between weather and climate. When we take a look at weather, that is what you see outside your window currently. So it's a short time frame of hours or days. We think about it in terms of a forecast. Whether it's hot and sunny or cloudy, whether it's snowing or freezing drizzle, it's usually a short time frame that we take a look at. So if we were to take a look in our closet, weather would be what we decide to wear on that particular day at that particular time. When we take a look at climate, on the other hand, climate is an average or a long-term state that we're going to take a look at. So it's determined in years, like 30-year means. So it's the weather conditions of an expected area over a long period of time. So if we relate that back to our closet again, what we're going to have in our closet related to climate is going to be all the different types of clothes that we have. Whether it be shorts or sweaters, we have a lot of different types of clothes in there that are going to relate back to what climate means. In 2014, what we had is understanding and assessing climate change implications for Nebraska. It was a report that was put out, and it's a stakeholder identified issues. So what it was is it's just something to start that conversation about climate change for Nebraska. But we need to be aware of those predictions that are out there, whether we're going to have global warming or whether we're going to have the deep freeze. This is just something out there to start that conversation with people. So what we need to do is we need to understand those impacts and what those impacts mean and those implications. And what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about those horticultural implications. We're going to talk about how that climate affects the plant material that we have and what it could possibly lead to down the road. This also allows us an opportunity to build resiliency. And we can build that resiliency in that community green space. What can we do in our communities that are going to be affected, and how can we make those be long-term situations that we can handle? We also need to take a look at some of those predictions for Nebraska. So what they looked at is they looked at temperature, precipitation. They also took a look at drought because that's something we have to deal with. We also looked at the frost-free season because that's also changing. And then the implications for plants. If we have a change in temperature, or if we have a change in our hardiness zones, or if we have a change in our frost-free dates, that all plays a role in the plant material that we're going to select, as well as their long-term survivability. Now, our average growing environment in Nebraska, our average frost-free date for the east is going to be around April 30th. For the west, it's going to be about May 21st. So our average daily temperatures in Nebraska range quite a bit. We're going to range from just under 9 degrees to up to 90 degrees. And then we talk about precipitation in Nebraska. Eastern Nebraska is going to get quite a bit more than western Nebraska, and that plays a big role in the plant material that we can select, also their long-term survivability. You know, we also have those hot, dry summers, we've got heat waves, and we also have our drying winds. Most of the time, we're going to have driest conditions from the middle of June until August. It always seems that it begins to rain sometime around State Fair because we're always out there, and it always seems to rain during State Fair in August. Then we've got our fluctuating winter temperatures. And when we say extremes, we had one of those extremes this year when we had negative degree temperatures for an extended period of time. Some people call them the polar vortex, but we need to keep in mind those fluctuating temperatures are a big difference across our state. If we look at western Nebraska this year, some of those plant materials is already starting to break bud. And if we take a look at our average frost-free date, they can get frost all the way up till near the end of May. So there are some different things that are going on this year that are going to be different than any other year. Our cold hardiness zone update is not due to climate change, but it's due to better models and better data collection and that type of a thing. We're going to see those extremes still begin to happen, but we're just getting better reports and better information in order to predict those zones. So in the past, if you look on the left-hand side in 1990, the blue zone was in zone 4A, and the lighter colored zone was in zone 5A. Well, if we take a look at the one that's done in 2012, the medium blue zone is zone 5A, and then the turquoise kind of blue zone was 5B. So it may look like we changed plant hardiness zones, but what actually happened is we have better data, better able to predict those hardiness zones just a little closer. One thing that we really don't take a look at very often is that heat zone map. What this was is it was developed in 1997, and what it takes a look at is its average number of days per year above 86 degrees. So this is the point at which plants begin suffering damage. So we are zone 6 and zone 7, if we take a look at that. And zone 6, we have a range of 46 to 60 days above 86 degrees. If we're zone 7, we're looking at 61 to 90 days above 86 degrees. Now, why is this important? Now, we talked about the cold hardiness map, and now we take a look at the heat zone map, and there's usually a large difference between the cold temperatures and the warm temperatures. So you think about plant material in Nebraska, we not only have to think about the cold temperatures and the sub-zero temperatures, but they also have to deal with extremes on the other end when it comes to heat and humidity and things along those lines. So we can see some plants have a slow and painful death because they have issues handling both extremes of temperatures. What does weather impact? Well, we look at the weather impacts on the landscape plant selection. That's going to play a big role in the plants that you put out into your landscape. It also plays a big role in the placement of that plant material in your landscape. And then the management requirements are going to change, and then we're going to produce more large variabilities in those jumps in that temperature. So why do we need to build resilient landscapes? So remember back to the summer of 2012, increased heat stress, and we also had increased drought stress that year. We had a really dry summer across a majority of the state. We had lots of severe drought across the state, and that's something we need to keep in mind because it could potentially happen again. We also have an increase in extreme events. So think back to November of 2014, where we had really nice temperatures one day, and then we plummeted in temperatures. And we saw a lot of plant dieback and some bark blasting in certain plant material because we had that large temperature fluctuation. So what can we learn from that and take forward? We can also have a longer growing season due to the increased water use and extended pest issues too. So if we have a longer growing season, that means we're going to have to water longer. We're also going to have to play around and try to control those pests longer. And then also we talked about that hardiness zone change. Can we really get a zone 5 plant to survive that was once in a zone 4? And that's going to be something to take a look at, is because that cold hardiness zone has changed, but that plant material is still going to have to handle those large temperature extremes. And then we're also having increased rainwater runoff. When we take a look at our landscape and we have more impervious surfaces, we're going to continue to have increased rainwater runoff because of that. Now, building a climate resilient landscape, the growth is promoted or limited by that environment. So that's going to play a big role on whether or not that plant material survives or thrives in that landscape. Any environmental factor less than ideal is limiting. We don't grow our best and survive our best if we don't have that best environmental place that we like. So fertilization will increase nutrients, but it will not make up for that heat and drought stress. So that's something to keep in mind. And we also have increased watering, but we're still going to have heat and drought stress from that temperature extremes. Most plant problems are due to environmental stresses. So if we think about those plants that are placed in a location where we're going to have extremes, whether it's cold or heat, we're going to see those plants either directly or indirectly show more signs of stress due to that. And we need to make sure that we have the right plant in the right place. We preach about this all the time, but in order for the plant to do its best in that location, we need to make sure that that location is best for the plant. We also need to take a look at adapted plants and biodiversity. We preach about diversity in the landscape as much as possible, and that's going to be something that's going to help in long term to build that resilient landscape. And then also we need to take a look at the plant health management. What are we doing to make sure that that plant is doing its best and growing its best? So we need to react responsibly to those weather events and take corrective action when needed. We can start assessing the landscape now to see what can be done proactively, and then we can plan accordingly to those recommendations. So we've got the Weather Ready Landscapes infographics, and what we do is we take a look at the implications of the weather, or what does that event mean. We take a look at those climate variability trends, so whether we're going to have possibly more snow, more rain, more ice, things like that. Then we look at our reactive response and our proactive planning. So we've got these different event topics that we're going to talk about. We're going to start with winter, go through summer, then we're going to end with fall, and we're going to go throughout that growing season. So the first one is going to be that winter desiccation. So winter desiccation happens when the leaf and stem tissues lose more moisture faster than what the roots can absorb. So oftentimes we'll see trees or shrubs that'll start to show some signs of winter desiccation. It's often caused by extended periods with extreme winds, cold temperatures, and sometimes it's going to have to do with the amount of moisture that we have. If we have an extended dry period, we're going to see winter desiccation being more of an issue. Or if we get really cold and stay cold for an extended period of time, we're going to notice winter desiccation being an issue as well. So to start off in the landscape, what we want to do is preventatively, what we want to do is be proactive. So in order to be proactive, we want to look for those desiccation-prone plants in the landscape. So those common species are going to be arborvitae, spruce, white pine, euonymus, junipers, hollies, yews, and of course boxwood. What you can do is once those are identified, then we can take approaches to make sure that we minimize or prevent that winter desiccation issue. So whether we apply an anti-desiccant to that plant material, and we need to read and follow label instructions. What that anti-desiccant is it's a waxy substance to help seal over that leaf so that leaf doesn't lose too much moisture too quickly. And we need to make sure that we apply those products at the recommended time and when temperatures are above freezing. With anti-desiccants, we also need to make sure that we clean out that sprayer really well because it's kind of a waxy substance and it can gum up that sprayer really easily. Another thing that we can do to help prevent winter desiccation is to water soils around plants thoroughly in the late fall, early winter. So anytime our air temperatures are above 40 degrees, we want to do a slow soaking moisture to that plant, whether we use a soaker hose or a bucket or something to allow that water to soak in. We want it to soak in before the temperatures drop below freezing. We don't want an ice cube sitting on that root ball. Other things that we can do to help prevent winter desiccation is to install burlap. You can either wrap the plant in burlap or do some wind screens of some sort around those plants that are really prone to it. What else we could do is we can remove or replace those desiccation-prone plant material. It might not be your most ideal situation, but if you're dealing with desiccation on a regular basis and that plant material keeps getting hit and you're having to prune an extensive amount off of that, then we might even think about doing replacement. We need to group those plants together with the same water requirements. So whether it's zone 4, zone 5A, zone 5B, we want to mulch under trees and shrubs to that proper depth and deep water that plant material like we talked about, installing those plant screens. And then turf can also get winter desiccation. So making sure that that turf is dense and in good condition can help decrease the chances of that turf getting that. Unfortunately, some plant material is going to get winter desiccation. So what we want to do in terms of corrective actions is we need to examine the buds, the bark, and the stems to see if that tissue's been dried out. Now, like with this boxwood here, it was really easy to determine which ones suffered some winter desiccation. And we can go ahead and prune out those areas that are dried out or are showing some signs of that desiccation if it's safe to do so. Now, sometimes if we were to prune out all the sides that have winter desiccation, unfortunately, that might mean removal of the entire shrub, like the arborvitae that's pictured here. So what we can do is if we have that plant material that suffered winter desiccation, we need to keep the soil moist, not soggy or too dry in the seasons that follow that injury. We want to for sure avoid irrigation or fertilization in those years after that. Mulch always helps to avoid weed competition and also helps to keep that soil evenly moist. And we also want to make sure that we avoid placement of mulch right next to the trunk of the tree or the shrub or the plant. Not only does that kind of suffocate and kind of smother the plant, but it also allows a great opportunity for wildlife to get in there and kind of nibble on the plant material. So if we keep that mulch away and even around the outside of the plant, that can really help out long term. Now, we might need to consider replacement with zone adaptive hardy plant material. And like we showed earlier, we saw that hardiness zone map. And so these are some places where if we need to replace that plant material with plants that are not going to get winter desiccation, we need to know what zone we're in. So make sure that we plant for the proper hardiness zone for our area. ICE is the next one that we're going to talk about. So if you don't know what ICE is when liquid precipitation falls onto surfaces that are below 32 degrees. So oftentimes we'll see that rain come down, it's cold, and it's going to completely encase that plant material. So we're going to have the greater potential of damage based on the thickness of ice, and we're also going to see some greater damage if we have really high wind speed, because that wind is knocking around those plant materials that are completely encased in ice. So if at all possible, and if we have any choices, we're going to try to select plant material with dense or good strong wood and strong branching angles because they're less susceptible to breakage. So when we take a look at plant material that has a brittle, we're looking at like willows or sometimes some Lombardy poplars, that are really brittle with time. They're going to be faster growing trees, and so they're going to break a lot easier. When we take a look at co-dominant trunks, those are ones where we have two leaders that are growing really close together. What happens is in an ice event, what we can see is those co-dominant trunks start to split apart, and then we have some issues with the canopy failing with that. We all like to try to get our trees off to a good start. And one way to do that sometimes is to stake the tree to make sure that the root ball doesn't move. So it used to be that we would stake that plant high, we would make sure it wouldn't move, and we'd leave that thing on as long as possible. So what we're doing now when we're looking at staking plant material is we're going to stake it low on the tree. We're going to stake it just enough so the root ball doesn't move, but what we're going to have is we're going to have that trunk get some reflex tissue to make it stronger long term. And we only want to leave that staking material on for about a growing season, because after that, the tree should take off and that root ball should be starting to establish. We also need to monitor those trees for signs of decay. So if we see fungal growth on the bark, whether it's those big conch fungi that look like ears or shelves on the tree, we see discolored wood or large wounds or areas of rot, those are an indication that that portion of the plant could have rot and it might need to be removed. If we're seeing those big shelf fungus on there, that's an indication that the center of that is pretty rotten and it should be removed before it has an opportunity to fall on something or someone. So preventatively, we want to make sure that young trees are pruned correctly, so that way that tree develops a strong branching pattern. We also need to recommend good pruning practices. So what has happened in the picture on the left is they have gone through and they have topped the tree. The reason for that is they didn't want the tree to get too big, so it gets up to a specific height and then it gets chopped off. Well, what that does is that makes that plant put on advantageous growth at that cut, and it's weakly attached. And so what happens is especially in an ice event, if those branches get so heavy, or if we get some wind associated with that, we're going to see that tree bust open and break open, and a lot of those limbs start to fall off because they're weakly attached. So we need to follow the proper pruning practices to make sure that they're attached strongly and they're attached properly, and that we're not going to have an issue down the road. We also want to remove any of those dead, damaged, or diseased tree branches, and we need to do it properly. We need to make sure that we do it at the branch collar, and we don't want to leave stubs out there. And what this does is it helps to take that opportunity for those weakened branches or those dead branches to fall following an ice event. So after the ice has melted, then you want to take a look at the plant and see if any corrective pruning needs to be done, if there's any broken branches, and you need to do it when it's safe to do so from the ground. If you're not able to do it safely or you're not able to reach it, then we consider contacting an arborist, and they'll be able to make sure that that branch is removed properly. So any trees that have been uprooted or have trunk failure or more than 50% of their branches are broken, we might need to consider removing those trees. And we're talking about the mature trees that have been uprooted. Some of the younger trees, we can actually try to brace them back up, and those roots will take. So we want to avoid fertilization until that plant recovers. We also need to keep the soil moist following an ice event, but not soggy or dry, especially when we start to warm up. And mulch is always a good idea to help with the moderate soil temperatures and keep moisture consistent. We want to try to utilize sand or de-icing agents, especially de-icing agents that are safe to use near plant material. Salt will cause some issues on plant material, and we'll get salt damage from those. But we want to make sure that those hard surfaces are safe to walk on. So we need to select the proper products for that. We don't want to stand underneath trees that are covered in ice. Falling ice is a hazard. And we want to avoid walking across ice-covered turf. And what that'll do is that can cause damage to the turf once it starts to thaw and once we start to get into the growing season. We always want to wait for that ice to melt off naturally. We don't want to hit the branches to remove the ice, because when they're encased in ice, we can have some more damage if we're going out and knocking those branches around. Another common thing that we will see is we can see different dormancy breaks. And what that is when there are extended periods of warm temperature, and it tricks the plant into thinking that it's springtime. So what they will do is they will break bud, and they will begin to grow thinking that it's spring, and then they get shocked back into Nebraska weather, and it's actually still winter time. And so what we can see is we can see tissue damage to these newly emerging plant tissues. So one of the ones that comes to mind for dormancy breaks is always going to be the lovely apricot. They usually bloom early in the spring. They come out, they bloom perfectly, and then we get that average frost, and all the buds are gone, and all the flowers are gone, and that means all the apricots are gone. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that those plants that are prone to breaking bud early are in a location where it's not going to warm up too much in the spring. So sometimes locations in the landscape can speed up dormancy breaks, like brick facades on the south side of a house or plants surrounded by concrete. Those areas that are going to hold warmth and make the plant think that it's warmer than it actually is. We need to select the proper plant material, and then we need to watch the weather forecast. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about it, but those long stretches of unseasonably warm temperatures can sometimes make those plants break bud too soon. And so every gardener is out there making sure that, their lilacs are not breaking bud too soon, because if they do, then we're losing the flowers, and then there goes our spring show. To prevent issues with dormancy breaks, we need to make sure that the plants are well watered. We want to avoid that fall fertilization, and that especially goes for shrubs and roses and ground covers and perennials. So when we talk about some of those, we want to avoid fertilizing after July, and then we don't have that fleshy plant material as we go to the fall that can be more susceptible to damage from dormancy breaks. Mulching is always a good idea, especially that winter mulch on that marginal plant material that we know is going to break bud. Now with winter mulch, what we're looking for is we're looking at maintaining those cold temperatures. We're not looking at really protecting that plant material from the winter, but like I said, we have such a roller coaster of temperatures in Nebraska that winter mulch is going to help to maintain that cold temperature on that plant and not make it think that it's spring a little too soon. If dormancy breaks do happen, what we need to do is we need to allow those frosted leaves and blooms to fall off the plant naturally, and then we want to rake them up and compost them. I would, after we get out of the frost time, after we get out of our frost-free date, I go in and I go ahead and cut off those blackened stems or cut off some of those damaged parts. We want to avoid that fertilization too early. The reason for that is we don't want them to think that they've got enough food that go ahead and put on a lot of leaves and tissue that they can't sustain. We need to keep the soil moist around the plants. Mulching is another one. It's going to help to avoid weed competition, moderate the soil. And again, we need to make sure that we don't pile it up too close to the trunk of the plant material with that. At some point in time in Nebraska, there's going to be a tornado and there's going to be a wind event. So thunderstorms, tornadoes, and severe wind storms are just something that happens in the Great Plains, and they're something that we're going to see. The average number of tornadoes per year in Nebraska is around 54. And so at some point in time, there's going to be a tornado or a wind event that comes through. What we need to do in terms of our plant material is we need to make sure that we select those trees, again, with that strong wood, strong branching angles that are less susceptible to breakage. And again, considering those slower growing plant materials over the fast ones because they're going to have a little bit stronger wood. We also need to take a look at the root ball of the trees and shrubs before we plant them. We want to make sure that the trees are not pot bound or root bound where the roots are circling or going around in the pot. If they are, then we need to take some extra precautions to try to spread those roots out. So that way when we plant that tree, it's not continuing to think that it's in a container and circling around and around. It's going to allow that roots to go out and help to spread out. We want to avoid codominant trunks like the tree in the picture. What that does is when we get a wind event or a storm event, we're going to get some movement, we're going to get some twisting, and we're going to get some damage of that plant material to the point where we could see those start to split apart. And so we need to make sure that we address that early enough in the plant's life so we don't have problems later on down the road. We need to make sure that we don't plant our trees too deep. Ideally, we want that first set of roots to be at the soil grade. And so if it's too deep in there, it's going to not have the proper taper or the proper trunk flare visible above ground. So ideally, we don't want it to look like a post going in the ground. We want it to have a nice taper to the bottom. And if we do decide to use some supports or anything along those lines on those trees, we need to make sure we don't do it for too long. And then we need to continue to monitor the trees for signs of decay, like the tree in the picture. The area that's not covered by bark there in the center is starting to decay. Once we get to the point where there's a lot of decay in that, that's going to become more of a hazard and the bigger potential to fail at that point in time. So pruning trees correctly when they're young is going to be ideal so that tree develops a strong branching pattern. And if we've got mature trees, we need to make sure we remove any dead, damaged, or diseased to make sure we don't have an issue out there in case we do get a storm and we're going to see some of those branches start to come off. Also, we need to make sure that we pick the proper plant material for our zone, and that's going to go throughout this entire presentation, picking the proper plant material. So if we do have a storm, what we need to keep in mind, if we have small trees that are bent over or leaning, we could stake them for a growing season. And that's going to allow that plant to go ahead and try to get that root system reestablished. Unfortunately, if we have those large trees, like a large blue spruce that's going to topple over, your best bet's to remove it for safely. I know it's going to be hard to remove that big blue spruce, but long term, that's going to be your best bet. If we have the plant material that suffered some damage, again, avoiding fertilization and keeping the soils evenly moist and providing that mulch are going to help that plant long term. Now, the thing to keep in mind with storms, especially windstorms and tornadoes, is it could take several years for some plant species to show damage. And this is especially true when we think about those trees and they're twisting and they're turning, and then we're seeing them move around in the wind. Sometimes we won't notice it right away. It's going to take several years before we see that damage. If you have vegetable crops, you can keep them as long as the growing point is undamaged, but we need to remove and replace or reseed those damaged vegetables and bedding plants if they're beyond the point of no repair. If we have damage, we need to remove any dead, damaged, or diseased branches and do so safely, and you need to consult an arborist. So what happened with this tree here is, this is a mulberry. It actually had codominant leaders, and what happened is it took a wind event for that far one to fail. And that tree had been stressed for a while because the roots that you are seeing there are advantageous roots that it was putting on to try to hold it together to the other dominant or other leaders that were there. So it took just the right wind event for that tree to begin to fail. Now, if we would have properly looked at this tree, maybe earlier in its life, we could have removed one or two of those codominant leaders where we wouldn't have had this issue. When you take a look at this tree before it failed, what happened is it looked like it was all one trunk together. So if we would have examined it closer, we would have noticed that it was indeed 3 different leaders. Luckily, nobody was injured when this tree fell onto the neighbor's house, but it is something that we need to be on the lookout for because it takes that right conditions for that wind event to happen to see that plant fail. So if we have to remove some limbs, we want to leave those wounds open. We don't want to paint them or tar them because that traps moisture in back behind and we can get some rot fungi going on. So go ahead and leave it open to the environment. If we have leaves or blooms that fall off the plant naturally, we want to rake them up and compost them. We don't want to try to remove them. And again, if we have those trees that have been uprooted and they're large trees, they have trunk failures, or more than 50% of the branches are broken, we're going to consider removing those plants because their long-term survivability is pretty low. If we take a look at drought, now this is something that we really have no control on, but we can still take a look at it and see what are some things that we can do. So drought is just the deficiency of precipitation over an extended period of time. We're usually looking at a season or more. And so from 2000 to 2016, portions of Nebraska had at least abnormally dry conditions in 93% of the drought monitoring maps, and 76% of the maps had Nebraska in a moderate drought category. So if we think back to 2012, where we had our drought, we take a look at the drought map. If we remember that, we were exceptionally dry or extremely dry in a majority of the state. And so what we can see is we see those large cracks in the soil, and we see that soil that's been completely depleted of all moisture. And that's where we start to see some issues in terms of plant material. So our increased drought frequency and severity, we're seeing more droughts more often that are more severe. And the number of consecutive dry days increased by 1 to 3 days in that time period. We also are going to see a decrease in soil moisture from 5 to 10% by the time we get to 2,100. That seems like a long way away. But we're going to see more soil moisture depleted due to drought. So to start off, we need to take a look at our drought-prone plants in the landscape. So some of the common species in Nebraska are going to be arborvitae, white pine, and turf. There's a few other ones. Following the 2012 drought, we saw a lot of arborvitae and a lot of white pine here in central Nebraska take their time and have a slow death. But that's something to keep in mind is if you put that plant material in, you need to make sure that you're able to get it moisture if we do get into a drought. We need to mulch with wood chips, and again, to conserve that soil moisture, and water thoroughly if at all possible. We want to try to plant that well-adapted plant material and right plant for the right place, and we also want to group that plant by water, light, and care needs. If we're able to promote those dense stands of turf grass, that's going to help out, especially if we get into a drought event. And ideally, we want to audit that irrigation system for proper water placement on a regular basis, just to make sure that if we have an in-ground system, it's getting water to the locations that need it instead of watering the sidewalk or the driveway. So we need to make sure we're putting water on places that we need it. We're going to look at that mulching, and then fertilizer. Ideally, we don't want to fertilize in that time of a drought, and we need to make sure that we meet the irrigation needs of that plant category. So by clustering that plant material together, we're able to provide the water that it needs. We need to evaluate the plant's value in the landscape. So let's take a look at our landscape. What's going to take longer to reestablish, a tree and a shrub or turf? In a drought instance, and if we have water restrictions that are put into place, we need to make sure we water that plant material that's going to take the longest to replace. So we're looking at trees and shrubs as being our first priority if water restrictions are put into place. Then we're going to take a look at those perennials. And unfortunately, I know we all like our vegetable gardens and our turf, but if water restrictions are put into place, those are going to be the lower priority ones because they're easier to replace if needed. Following a drought, we need to take a look at our plant material, examine the bark and the buds to see if those tissues are dried out. And if they're dried out and dead, then at that time we need to prune out what is no longer living. Keeping the soil moist is key, and again, we don't want to fertilize that stressed plant material. Wood chips are great, and again, we need to place those wood chips not next to the trunk of the tree because we can have some issues with suffocation and critter damage. And then the drought's impacts on some trees might not be recognized for a few years. Following the 2012 drought, it was 2013 and even 2014 before we start to see some of those trees really fail with time. The reason for that is if you think of a tree, it sucks up water from the root system and takes it up into the upper canopy. And it uses a water column like a siphon. Well, if that water pressure is broken in that and it's no longer able to suck up that water as well as it could, and then we start to see that tree fail on the upper part because that water column has been broken in that tree. If lawns didn't receive enough moisture to keep the crowns alive, then we're going to need to overseed to reestablish turf. So if we take a look at our two common turf grasses that are cool season, we're looking at Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. If Kentucky bluegrass doesn't receive enough moisture, it'll go summer dormant. But we still need to provide some moisture to those crowns to keep them alive, even if they're summer dormant. If we have tall fescue, on the other hand, they don't have a summer dormancy. So if your tall fescue goes brown, it's dead, and you're going to have to look at replacement. Some of our other plant material, like our buffalo grass, is a native grass. It has a deep root system. It's better able to handle that drought, but it's still going to need a little bit of water for that crown to stay alive. So on the opposite side of drought, then we've got flood. So when we take a look at flood, that's what happens when we have extreme rain events in low-lying areas and streets. We'll see more devastating events like river flooding, especially near like Lincoln or Omaha, is where some of these pictures were taken. So when it comes to flood, we pick the right plant for the right place. So oftentimes we will have those low-lying areas that we know are going to be prone to a little bit of water damage. We want to make sure that we have plants that are tolerant of those wet sites in those areas because they have a tendency to remain wet. We want to try to avoid putting plant material who don't like to have wet feet in those low-lying and flood-prone areas because they're not going to survive long-term. We want to make sure that we have a plant that likes it wet in those areas, or they can handle that intermittent wet and dry. If we have any tree branches, we want to make sure we remove any dead, damaged, or diseased because we want to make sure that that tree is in overall good health before we get to that flood event. And we need to plant that adapted plant material. I didn't say native, I said adapted. And that's the plant material that will survive in our location and in our zone that do extremely well. It doesn't matter if it's native or introduced, just as long as that plant material is adapted for that location, it will do well. To reduce that runoff in the landscape during heavy rain events, ideally we want to try to soak it in and let it, we want to slow it down and soak it in. And the reason we can do that with some rain gardens, some bioswales, we can even do it with a low berm. And we want to direct that rainwater to where it's wanted or where it will reduce flooding risk. Like I said, with the increase of impervious surfaces, we're having more runoff, and that runoff can go into the storm drains if you have them, and we can see that water kind of take and go into the other places where it's going to go, whether it's down the storm drain or down to the river or down the creek or even down the gutter. So we want to encourage that rainwater to soak in with good soil management. We want to try to increase organic matter of those soils if at all possible, try to reduce the soil compaction, and we're going to try to do that with aeration or tillage where feasible. When we allow that water to soak in, it's not going down the storm drain, but it's being allowed to soak in an area that the plants can use it and where it can infiltrate down into the aquifer again. So plant roots need air just as much as they need water. So what happens in a flood event or in a water event where we have a lot of moisture at one time, that pore space can be filled up in between the soil particles with water for extended periods of time. Over 48 hours, we could possibly see these plants become stressed. They could start showing symptoms of too much water, like yellowing of the leaves, drooping appearance. Oftentimes the symptoms of too much water will also be similar to those of not enough water. The plant in the picture, what it is it's a willow, and in response to all that moisture, that willow put roots on, advantageous roots in an area on the trunk of the tree. And so that plant is trying to get some air to that plant because the soil is completely saturated around it. If we have a flood, the main thing we need to keep in mind, especially in the vegetable garden, is we need to remove and dispose of all garden produce that hasn't come in contact with the flood waters. The reason for that is because we don't know what's in that flood water. We're going to consider it contaminated, we're going to be better safe than sorry, and we're going to take it out without a question. We don't know if, in one instance, there was a cattle feed yard upstream, so we could get it contaminated from that. We don't know if gasoline or oil are going to be in the floodwaters. So any part of the plant that is edible and comes in contact with the floodwater needs to be removed. We remove any dead, damaged branches, so that way we are not having the issue of it failing down the line. If you're unable to reach them properly, we need to consult an arborist. And then with a flood, we're going to wait and watch for those secondary pest problems. Because the plants potentially were underwater for an extended period of time, those plants could be stressed, and we could see secondary problems of insects or fungi or other pathogens on stressed plant material. So keep an eye on them. And even if that plant was in floodwaters for an extended period of time, we also need to make sure that once that soil dries out following that flood event, we need to keep that plant evenly moist and not too soggy and not too dry. We don't want to shock that plant material and keep that soil too dry following an event where it had a lot of moisture. We also need to mulch with wood chips and avoid that fertilization. Now, little is known about the long-term effects of flood on plant material. So just like with our tornado and our wind events, realize that it could take several years before some plant species start to show signs of damage. If we have an extreme precipitation event or we have localized flooding, what you can do is you can pull back that mulch around that plant material to help speed that soil drying, because we talked about that mulch around the plant helps to conserve moisture, and it's going to do a really good job pulling that moisture in when we're having times of water shortages. But it's also going to hold that moisture in following a flood event. So what we want to do is try to move that mulch away, allow that soil to dry out, and then you can put the mulch back once that has allowed to dry out over time. Hail is something that we're going to have at some point in time. So the frequency of hail in the United States is greatest in the Great Plains. What happens is it forms when rain or ice particles are carried on updrafts with thunderstorms, and then they collide with the freezing, and then it goes back up into the system and falls back down. So when it comes to hail, less than an inch in southern Nebraska, we're going to see 5+ days of that. In northern Nebraska, we're going to see 3 to 4 days of that. And greater than 2 inches, we've got a 1 day and a half a day for northern Nebraska with that. And so that's the thing to keep in mind. On average, 70% of the hail reports in Nebraska occur between May and July. So that's when we're going to see the majority of those hail events. So before we get to a hail event, we need to make sure that that plant material is in overall good health, because we don't know when that hail event is going to happen. If it's forecasted that we're going to have severe thunderstorms or the potential of hail, what we want to do is we want to bring those potted plants and trees into a temporarily protected location. So whether that's in the garage or in a shed, if you can safely move it, I would move it indoors, so then you don't have to worry about the possibility of hail damaging that plant material. What you can do in the vegetable garden is you can do hoops with floating row covers to help to prevent that hail damage to vegetable crops. Sometimes we have a lot of heads up on when those storms are coming, sometimes we don't. And so there are times where we might not have enough time to help protect that plant material. But once hail damage does happen, the impact from hailstone can damage leaves and stems. It can also affect fruits and vegetables. And the size of the hailstone, the amount of hail, the time of year, and the wind speed plays a big role in the amount of damage to the plant material. So if we have a few pea-sized hailstones that come down without much wind, we're not going to see a lot of damage. When we get to that golf ball, baseball-sized hail with quite a bit of wind, that's when we're going to start to see that plant material really get beat up. Following a hail event, we want to use that corrective pruning for broken branches if it's safe to do so. Cut off any severely damaged flowers and stems with bypass pruners just above the node. If, however, we do have some of those annual flowers that do not have any remaining foliage, or after a week they're not showing any signs of recovery, we just want to go ahead and pull them out, because they're not going to be surviving very long term. If it's early enough in the season, you could replant in those areas. Sometimes hail events happen a little bit later in the season, and there's not a lot we can do for replacement. Again, avoid fertilization until that plant recovers is going to be key for that. We need to keep that soil moist around the plants, because we don't want to keep them too wet or too dry. We want to make sure that they have enough moisture in order to maintain that health. Mulching with wood chips to avoid the weed competition. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to monitor plants for signs of canker on twigs and branches and prune these out if needed. So what happens with canker is it takes advantage of that hail wound, and the fungal spores get in there. And sometimes what we can see is we can see death from that point out. So we need to take a look at the branch, and if we notice that there's a hail wound, and then from that point up, we're going to prune off that damage. Again, sometimes canker or hail damage isn't going to affect it that immediately that first year. It could take a little time before we start to notice some of those signs of damage. Lastly, we're going to take a look at frost, because that's usually the next thing that we're going to notice at the end of the season is our frost damage on plant material. So if we take a look, our frost-free season has increased by 1 to 2 weeks since 1991. So on average, by 1 week statewide in Nebraska. So our frost-free season is extending that growing season for that plant material by about a week. And what that means is we're also taking a look at, it's expected to increase an additional 2 weeks down the road. So we think about the plant material that we put in, we're looking at an average of 130-ish growing degree days, if at all possible. If we extend that growing season, we're now going to be able to grow different plant material that we couldn't have already done because we've increased our growing season. So frost is when ice crystals form on a surface. What we will notice on that leaf surface is we're going to notice those ice crystals on there. When we look at our average last frost in the spring, mid-April in southeast Nebraska, northwest Nebraska is going to be mid-May. Our average first frost in the fall is going to be early October for southeast Nebraska, and usually it's mid-September for northwest Nebraska. When we're trying to prevent frost damage, what we're going to do is make sure that we plant the proper plant material for our zone. We also want to pay attention to the weather forecast. When we see frost is going to be those nights without cloud cover, and we're going to see the most damage during that time frame. We want to make sure that the soils around the plant are watered thoroughly in late fall, so they enter winter moist and not soggy or dry. So if we've got a vegetable garden, what we want to try to do is we want to make sure that we water that vegetable garden early enough in the day. So if we have sunlight that's out there, that water is going to help, if the soil is moist, it's going to help to hold heat in. And we're going to see that will carry over a little bit later into the evening with that soil. If frost is predicted, what we want to do is we want to cover the susceptible low-growing plants in the evening with sheets or tarps or blankets. What we have here is we have my vegetable garden. Don't look at the weeds, but my vegetable garden, and I wasn't quite ready to give up on some of my plant material just yet. So what I did is I took sheets out. We talked that frost is when those ice crystals form on the leaf surface, and that's when we start to see that damage is when that ice crystal comes in contact with that. If we use a sheet, a blanket, or a tarp, those ice crystals are going to come in contact with that material, and they're not going to come in contact with the leaf. And so what that's going to do is going to minimize that contact between the cover and the foliage and the leaf. And then come in the morning, once the threat of frost has passed, we want to remove the covering from those plants when the temperatures begin to warm up, because we want that sunlight to be able to penetrate and hit that leaf surface. If you have an area, or if you have those potted plants that you're able to bring in, we want to make sure that we bring them in into a protected location until those temperatures warm up to 50 degrees above or that threat of frost has passed. We want to make sure that we avoid that fall fertilization of trees, shrubs, roses, ground covers, perennials. The reason for that is if we fertilize them too late in the season, some of them will put on secondary growth or advantageous growth that's not going to be extremely hardy, and it's not going to be ready for that frost when we get to that point in time. So we move those frost tender plants inside. If we have other plant material in the vegetable garden, we can put down those floating row covers or those hoops over the top of them. If we have plant material that's easy to do so, we want to try to reestablish that mulch around the crown of the plants. We want to try to avoid pruning back that damaged plant material right away, because what can happen is if we have some death on some plant material, we go in and prune it, and then we could get another threat of frost, and then we see more death and dieback in that plant, and then we're having to remove that much more. If we've got tender vegetables or bedding plants, if we get frost, you can either replace them or we can plant new ones. So if we have those warm season vegetable crops, we know they're not going to appreciate frost very much. What we can do is if they are taken with frost and they do die, we can put in those cold crops that like the cooler temperatures. I'm thinking of kale, I'm thinking of cabbage, I'm thinking of other cool season crops that are going to like and withstand those cold temperatures. And if the soil temperatures are too cold, like I said, we're going to replace with other vegetable crops. We want to allow the frosted leaves to fall off the plant naturally. We don't want to go around and pull them off. We want the plant to take advantage of that for us. You can cut off those blackened stems with those pruners, avoid fertilization. Most of the time, we're going to wait until summer of the following year before we even think about fertilizing. And then making sure that those soils are kept moist are going to be key with that. What we have here is we've got my lemon cucumber that I just didn't have enough sheets to cover, and this is what it looks like. You can tell that a plant has suffered frost damage because those leaves are going to be like a darker green. They're going to be water soaked, and then with time they're going to get kind of crunchy and they're going to start to dry out. So we want to make sure that one of the vegetable crops we want to avoid using once it gets frosted is going to be rhubarb. So once we get rhubarb, it has a hard freeze and we start to notice that leaf tissue is looking water soaked and dark colored. I like to refer to it as like frozen lettuce. If we see that type of a leaf on a rhubarb, then we want to avoid using that rhubarb. There's oxalic acid in the leaf of the rhubarb, and when it's frozen, it goes into the stalk, and we can see that increase of oxalic acid in the stalk. So that's one of the vegetables we want to avoid using once we get through a freeze. So some of our final thoughts. You know, unfortunately, weather variability will not go away. That's just something that we're going to have here in Nebraska. We're going to see the highs and the lows on a regular basis. Floor plant selection and placement is expensive. It's expensive in time, money, and resources. So if we don't put the right plant in the right place, we're going to either have to replace it, we're going to have to put more time and energy into it. So we need to make sure we pick the proper plants. We can see more increase in maintenance and chemical inputs with poor plant selection. If those plants are stressed, they're going to be more susceptible to pathogens and pests. So making sure that that plant is happy is always going to be key. And sometimes we just work with what we have and we can make changes along the way. Sometimes we inherit a landscape that somebody else has done. And so with time, we're going to start to try to make changes so that way we have the landscape that we want. We have a landscape that's going to survive long term. We want to try to use those microclimate, that slope, and the wind patterns to our advantage. We know that our winter winds are going to come from the northwest. We know that our summer winds are going to come from the southwest. We know that the different slopes are going to play a role. So I talked about our apricot earlier. We want to make sure that we put an apricot on a south-facing slope instead of or a north-facing slope instead of a south-facing slope, because that south-facing slope is going to warm up earlier in the spring, and that's going to make it break bud. If it's on a north-facing slope, it's going to remain cool, the roots are going to remain cool, and it's not going to break bud as early in the spring. So use that to your advantage. Use locally adapted plant material, and we need to make sure that we put the right plant in the right place. We talked a lot about proper mulching practices, and that's not only for weeds, but it's also for moisture to keep that soil moist under that plant material. If at all possible, try to reduce the narrow, tiny strips of turf in areas, because we all know that place between the curb and the sidewalk that gets super hot, the inferno strip. No plant material is going to be very happy there, but if we put turf grass there, we're going to have to keep watering it on a regular basis more than we would in a big lawn situation. So reducing those narrow turf grass areas are going to help out long term. And then with anything, we're looking at a biodiversity, we're looking at a mix of different species, and that's going to be key for long term. When we have a diversity, then we're not able to have as much of an impact if we have a specific pest or pathogen that comes in and targets a particular plant. All the information that I talked about today is available on these weather-ready landscape infographics. And so this is a website where you can go, weatherready.unl.edu/weather-ready-landscapes. And so all that material that I talked about today is in there. They're nicely done. They are very visually appealing, and they make it easy to read. All the materials that I talked about today are in there. We also had a few references that we used. And with that, I thank you. And happy gardening and stay warm out there.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Was that okay, Terry?